What's up everyone, it's Team Torchwood here. Opeth just released their first single in 5 years. I'm going to be listening to S1 for my first ever time. Let's do this. One second. I'm just going to pre-order the album real quick.
So, hello everybody and welcome back to another discography ranking. Today is a very, very special day indeed because we will be tackling the 14 studio album discography of Opeth. I've been waiting, quite a long time to eventually tackle this band, but when we got the announcement that they were finally releasing a 14th album, I figured I'd wait until The Last Will and Testament came out and then rank that album with the other 13 that had come previous to it. But on a whole, this band releases nothing but gold in my opinion, so ranking these albums has been incredibly difficult leading up to this video. So without any more waffle, let's get straight into it. My personal least favourite Opeth album unfortunately has to be Pale Communion for me. There is stuff that I like about it, but overall when it comes to Opeth's prog rock years, they're like 3 or 4 albums with no growls, as they're notoriously or infamously known for. Pale Communion offers the least that keeps me coming back to it. Not to say that it's bad though. I really enjoy Eternal Rains Will Come. That song is just full of really bright and lush hooks and some really proggy moments in there. Cusp of Eternity has some really catchy grooves. I enjoy the vocal harmonies in there, and it has some seriously creative riffs as well. I very much enjoy Moon Above Sun Below's darker, spookier tone. It kind of reminded me of what I liked so much on their more gothy centric albums like Reveries or Watershed. That song feels like there could have been the implementation of a few growl moments that could have made the song have a bit of an edge. I will also say, however, Elysian Woes and Goblin kind of kill the momentum of the album for me. Those songs really do just kind of pass me by. I never find myself going, those are the songs I want to listen to, especially for this album. There are better than those for me. River is a fun proggy tune that honestly gives me Dream Theater vibes, which I welcomed personally. It's got cool uplifting guitar melodies in there that I really enjoyed. Voice of Treason needs no introduction. Everyone loves that song off this album, if nothing else. It's a fun, really bombastic rock opera moment with really cool, empowering vocal hooks, which, if that's what they were going for on this album, then they fully succeeded, because that song in particular needed 0 growls to make it as epic as it did. They really succeeded in that song in particular. Faith in Others is a sweet somber moment as well. It definitely sounds like it's been plucked right out of the track listing of something like Damnation, right? What I will say is I think this album has a tiny bit of an identity crisis. Because of it being the album to follow Heretige and keeping in mind the sort of backlash that Heretige got, Pale Communion kind of had a little bit of a panicky moment where it didn't really know what it wanted to be. Like, it was trying to be a new direction for the band, but ironically the moments I enjoyed on this album are the moments that remind me of better albums. I would have respected this album a bit more if the band dug their heels in a bit more with the prog rock sound that they wanted to explore, rather than like kind of just use it as a half measure, if that makes sense at all. Now we move on to my 13th favourite Opeth album with Sorceress. Okay, this is their 3rd entry in their prog rock years. I'm already starting to see the comments come through of, where's Heretige? Why is Heretige so high? And don't worry, we will get to that album. But I personally think that Sorceress was definitely a step up from Pale Communion, but maybe didn't achieve what I was hoping they would achieve with their prog rock direction. But this album is a lot of fun. The mix definitely allows the music to feel a bit heavier and denser and chonkier than their previous 2, which they got criticism for at the time. So Sorceress was a direct response to that criticism in the production. The strings to kick things off is sweet and sugary sounding. The title track is wacky and groovy, and the chuggy guitar really works for me. Wildflowers is also another fun song. It has really cool like syncopated riffs. Will-o'-the-Wisp is fun and angelic and also acoustic, and I really enjoy the tempo on that one too. Sorceress 2 has a cool flowery tone that shifts into an eerie tone throughout it. I've really enjoyed that one. 7th Sojourn, is that if that's how you pronounce that song name, is fun but a fairly bloated instrumental track, for me at least. Strange Brew is fun. The guitar tone especially is sick on that track, I won't lie, I really enjoyed it. Fleeting Glance and Era both have catchy guitar hooks and vocal melodies to boot. The Ward is sweet and mellow and also uplifting, and then Spring as the closing track is more of those bright hooks, but sends the record off in a really cool solo that I enjoyed. I don't mind the clean vocals being the only thing available on this album, but it's more the vocal melodies don't complement the denser riffs that we get on this one. It makes the overall sound of the album a bit uneven for me. But I think Sorceress has a clearer direction than Pale Communion, which is why I ranked it one tier higher than it. But now we move on to my number 12th spot, and this is unfortunately going to have to be Orchid. It's a great staple of early prog death metal, but for me, Opeth have done much better than this since this got released. I will say, technically, this album is really impressive for a band's first outing and it being released in '95. And there are some really memorable moments on here. In Mist, She Was Standing kicks off nicely with a cool thrashy death chug, but then it switches gears into a cool gloomy atmospheric moment. Really enjoyed this song after the 6-minute mark. It felt so dense with mood. The nice doom-laden guitar work in Under a Weeping Moon is brilliant. Obviously that song needs no introduction, but just have to shout out that moment in it. The use of acoustic guitars creates such a haunting tone as well for that song. I love that they just broke up the album with the creepy piano stuff in Silhouette. Forest in October and Twilight Is My Robe both have some cool heavy chug and riffage. But what I will say though, and this is a criticism for most of this album, some songs maybe don't justify their length as maybe they should. Some songs feel like they have a bit of too much filler potentially. They definitely could have trimmed the fat on a few of them, and those two songs there in particular could have done with that. They don't need to be 10 minutes. However, I did very much enjoy the guitar melodies that closed Twilight Is My Robe. Was so good. The acoustic interlude in Apostle in Triumph is really fun. The song itself as well, I think, is the proudest moment on the album. I think it has what this album does best packaged in that song, and the fact that that song is a closer, that fucking scared the shit out of me. That should not have fallen like that. I'll put it back up in a minute. The fact that that song is the closer, that final note, is such an epic finale. But with my criticism of maybe the songs having too much bloat aside, the production on this album is a wee bit tinny for my taste. So like the death metal riffs and growls lose some of their low end thanks to this production, which was a loss in my personal opinion. What I will say is even on their earliest work, the band can go from the fast and ferocious to the mellow and somber and even the haunting tones, you know? The change-ups don't always transition as smoothly as I imagine the band hoped, but it does show promise for where the band would go next and later on in their career. For a first outing, man, I can't reiterate enough how impressive Orchid is for its time. But they did make better, and we'll get to better. At the number 11th spot, we have Morningrise, their follow-up album to Orchid. How fitting. But before we do get on to Morningrise, I'm just going to put this flag back up if I can. Go up there, you bastard! Oh, you twat! Don't try this at home, kids. This is not safe. Standing on a swivel chair. Ah! Oh my god, my life just flashed before my eyes. And it was fucking boring. Right, where were we? Oh yeah, Morningrise. So table dressing first. The production doesn't see that much of an improvement from Orchid to Morningrise, but what does see a big improvement between these two albums is the songwriting. The heaviness, none of it gets sacrificed between these two albums either. It is simply just technically more sound, and the transitions between certain parts are a bit less jarring. Advent starts the album with some fast galloping riffs, but also sets a cool downtrodden vibe for the album. Night and Silent Water and Nectar both have haunting yet also lush and catchy lead riffs. Obviously, Black Rose Immortal needs no introduction. It's epic in scale. Maybe doesn't need to be 20 minutes. I know it's blasphemous to say, but its effectiveness is undeniable. But I think it gets its point across by the 15-minute mark. I won't lie, but don't crucify me. Bid You Farewell is so mournful in tone, but it ramps up from mellow and somber to like stomping and heavy. Best song on here and a perfect way to close out the album, in my opinion. More on the production side of it, though it has the same sort of tinny sound that Orchid did. I think the mellow acoustic moments are achieved to much greater effect on here than on Orchid. And I also think that Morningrise finds a greater success in mood and atmosphere than its previous album. Much like Orchid, the lengthy songs do lose me somewhere in the album's duration. Overall, Morningrise has a similar positive and negative ratio to Orchid, just slightly more successful in its mood and atmosphere, which is the big contributor as to why Morningrise is ranked higher than Orchid for me. But now we move into the top 10, which we are finally going to be talking about Heretige. I'm sorry that I ranked it this high, but this is my list, so if you don't like it, go talk about how much a poser I am in the comments. This album gets so much flack because it was the first of the less loved prog rock era of the band, and I can see the criticism. Watershed, Ghost Reveries, Blackwater Park, they are fucking phenomenal albums. Believe me, I know. We haven't spoken about them in this video yet because they're ranked higher for me, but that doesn't automatically mean that Heretige is bad just because it shifted direction from that stuff. In most people's minds, the daylight robbery of Mike's growls is the thing that plagues this album. People think that the absence of the growls ruins this one and this album would be better off if he was deaf growling. I'm inclined to hard disagree with that criticism. I don't understand where that came from. If you have ears, you know that Heretige does not fit the death metal vocals. A lot of this album is like classic prog rock, so to shoehorn in growls in there would just make this album feel like it has more of an identity crisis than Pale Communion for me. The instrumental title track leading into Devil's Orchid is so cool. And speaking of Devil's Orchid, it's really fun. It's a really groovy rocker. I particularly enjoy the closing minute of that song as well. I Feel the Dark is a subtle, moody track that just reminded me of stuff that I liked off of Damnation. The descending lead melody of Slither is a lot of fun, and same with Lines in My Hand. Those songs both have a lot of fun energy. The soothing atmosphere in the song Hack's Process, I think is how you say that, is so sweet. Speaking of old-fashioned proggy moments, Famine is such a fun little song with all sorts of groovy guitar flourishes in it. Folklore is a prog rock epic. Marrow of the Earth acts like a nice calming down send-off, but could definitely been shaved off a minute or two for me for the closing track. I obviously prefer Opeth's earlier albums, I'll say again. I'd much rather Opeth progress their sound and try new things like prog rock rather than to stagnate and release the same album over and over. I just love the bold decision to do a hard left turn from progressive death metal to prog rock, which is why I'm willing to give Heretige its time of day. Anyway, now moving on to my 9th favourite Opeth album, which is going to be My Arms Your Hearse. Let's just get straight into it. This is a fucking classic album. The prologue into April's Ethereal is a great way to set the tone for the album. The rhythm and hooks are catchy throughout the entire opening track. I love the serene acoustic transition between April Ethereal and When, until When explodes with brutal riffs and growls and a galloping rhythm, just headbang worthy. And Madrigal, if that's how you pronounce that song name, is a nice somber moment, if maybe a tiny bit unnecessary. Before Amen Corner kicks the gates in with heaviness, this one carries a monstrous tone through lots of off-kilter riffs. Demon of the Fall is a classic that speaks for itself. It's a favourite across the board, the fanbase love it for a reason, and I very much share these affections with Demon of the Fall. It is heavy, hooky, and creepy in tone. Speaking of, Credence is a very mellow but also creepy and yet calming, the band's first attempt at a full ballad. As for Karma, that song quickly breaks up the calm and mellow tone in place for more brutal and intense riffage. It's very creative with the melodies that are in that song though, I will say. Despite that song being 8 minutes, That one flew by for me. This album is where the band started to get the hang of writing songs that justify their length. Between this third record and their first two, they have really learned how to trim the fat off of songs and really justify their extended runtime if they warrant it. Epilogue is a fun, soothing instrumental for the album. It's a nice bow out, if maybe a tad too long, which, like I say, does contradict my compliment of their previous songs on the album, but I think this closer being slightly longer does ease us out of the album quite nicely. The overall production provides a haunting echo to Mike's growls, and that adds just an edge to the overall experience and atmosphere. Mike also includes a noticeable amount more of his clean vocals on here than on his previous two albums. This is the beginning of what the fanbase would consider their perfect stretch of albums, and I'm inclined to agree to a certain point, and this is probably the first, if you don't want to count Morningrise, where they achieve a form of creepy, dense atmosphere that lingers throughout the entire album. And the fact this is their third album shows a sign of great things to come for the band. But now we move on to the 8th album, where we are finally going to be talking about the final prog rock album so far. In Cauda Veninum. Many people kind of agree that this is the best of their prog rock years. Not that the rest of them are bad, but I think this has a certain edge over the others for its cinematic quality. I will also say the choice to release this in Swedish and in English was a nice touch personally, and I enjoy both versions. Let's go through the tracks though. Garden of Earthly Delights soars in with an ominous droning. It does very well at setting the stage for what's to come. Maybe goes on a tad too long, but then Dignity explodes onto the scene. There's a certain grit and vinegar that the band shows here with this song. The guitar solo in Dignity is fucking excellent as well. I enjoy the faster pace of Heart in Hand, and it has some great guitar flourishes in there. The vocal hooks as well are just brilliant, and Mike's clean vocals on this album as a whole are so beautifully done. Maybe it's the production mixed with his skill that he's refined by this point, but his clean vocals seem to bellow in a way that hadn't really happened to the same effect before this album. Next of Kin has a slower, stomping, doomy tempo. Lovelorn Crime is dripping with sorrowful moods. Charlatan manages to pick up the pace and energy for the album for another old school proggy moment. In that song, the bass tone like just rumbles your bones. Universal Truth starts so soothing with Mike's vocals. His cleans are just crooning in the mix throughout that entire song. The vocal harmonies are beautiful alongside the orchestral elements. Garrotter and Continuum build out the mood and overall atmosphere before the final track. All Things Will Pass is a beautifully epic piece. It just acts to close out the album in the approach of a power ballad of sorts. The spoken word element of this album is so much fun. Guitars sound gorgeous in this album. There is overall a strong theatrical edge to this record, which just makes it sound way more epic and grandiose. Once again, Mike's cleans work so much better on this album than on previous prog rock. They just somehow pack a punch so much. Overall, the mood on this album feels very full of soul. I really enjoyed this one, and I wasn't expecting to. I never really visited this one very much before the lead up to this ranking that you're seeing today, to be honest. I obviously had heard songs here and there like Dignity and Heart in Hand, Universal Truth, but when you listen to the whole thing, you get a bigger appreciation for what this album's going for. But now, we do indeed move on to my 7th favourite Opeth, which is going to be the first one I heard, Deliverance. This album is, I wanna claim, being their most heavy, but Orchid and Morningrise might have something to say about it. Wreath smashes down the doors with a bone-crushingly heavy groove. I love the doom-laden riffs in there. The title track is a fucking masterpiece. The lead hook in A Fair Judgment is such an earworm. That song keeps such a doomy mood, but slows down for a more deliberate approach. Absent Friends is a truly beautiful and delicate piece. Its placing in an otherwise very heavy album is so welcome. Master's Apprentice is very low end and groovy, and By the Pain I See in Others, the most unsettling in tone from this album, and it boosts some of those more atmospheric and thrashy moments that we've seen on the earlier parts of this album. I'm not sure how well known this is, but this was originally planned to be a 2-part double album that Opeth was planning, where the heavier side would be on side A and then side B would be a more mellow part. It leaves this album with a heaviness that barely leaves for any room for somber moments, besides obviously Absent Friends. But it also follows up Blackwater Park, and if you know anything about that album, it's a tough act to follow. This, following Blackwater Park, it didn't do the same thing as Blackwater Park. It went for a heavier tone overall. But I really like it, man. I think it really, really works. But now we move on to my 6th favourite Opeth, and using the segue I was mentioning about it originally being a part A of a double album, we now move on to the album that was originally planned to be part B of the double album, where it was mostly mellow ballads and somber, more gothic moods. Damnation. This album is frankly beautiful. I think it would have worked if they put Deliverance and Damnation together as a double album. It would have worked so well. But they work equally as separate entities because they have such distinct identities apart from each other. This album being completely comprised of ballads and slower rocky moments leaves this one really standing out from the pack, in my opinion. The atmosphere is just gorgeous and dripping. Window Pane is basically melancholy in audio form and perfectly sets the mood for the album. In My Time of Need and End Credits are both oozing with despair. Death Whispered a Lullaby is such a creepy ballad. I love that one so much. The song Closure is dripping with atmosphere. The guitars croon in that one. Hope Leaves is so subtle and gentle, and also ethereal, dare I say. If there was a song to listen to while watching rain run down your window, it would be that one. Or anything off this album, frankly. To Rid the Disease, with its melody, is able to set you on edge and then give you a sense of calm as well. Weakness, instead of capturing a feeling of gloom or despair, feels way more peculiar. In an album full of subtlety, this feels the most reserved and stripped back, resulting in a very atmospheric conclusion for the piece. I think Weakness was a great choice to close on for this album. I want to reiterate, the gloomy, lush melodies and tones and atmospheres are so palpable on here. The somber vibe is palpable. It's perfect if you just want to sit and contemplate existence. It is so moody in tone. Without needing to raise its voice whatsoever, this album achieves so much musically. Beautifully written songs. I'm gonna stop gushing about Damnation and start gushing about Watershed. We're in the top 5 now. I'll be honest, I ran out of bad things to say about the albums since we started talking about My Arms, Your Hearse. Anyway, let's get on with it. I think starting this album off with a soft acoustic moment with Coil was such a good choice. It almost sounded like angelic in some ways, but then the sudden dark turn to Heir Apparent, one of my favourite Opeth songs of all time. I fucking love that song. It's just so jarring and packs such a punch, that song. That song sounds so evil with Mike's fucking ferocious vocals and the chuggy dense riffs. It feels like Mike accidentally let a Bloodbath song slip into an Opeth album. That's how heavy Heir Apparent is to me. In Lotus Eater, the lead riff and rhythm are bone-crushingly heavy, and the vocal hooks complement the tone and growls. Let's talk about Burden for a second. It's such a beautiful ballad that morphs from sweet and mellow to a perfect power ballad, and it's just such a gorgeously lush and serene song. Porcelain Heart is doomy with the use of its downtrodden melodies. Hussein Peel goes from sweet and somber to sour and bleak. Hexomega. What to say? Definitely the most haunting point on the album, dripping with atmosphere. All of that atmosphere then gets like drowned out by all the ingredients of the dense guitar melodies. Just such a great way to send out the album. Also a shout out to all of the bonus tracks that this album kills it with as well. The production is so good on here. It pushes the guitars to the front compared to their earlier work where it sounded a bit more mushed together with the growl vocals. And the mix of Mike's cleans and growls are perfect. The album displays such a full scope of range of Opeth's capabilities as a band. Shows the intense heaviness and the soothing, groovy, sweet and sour melodies. But that was indeed Watershed. Now it's time to finally talk about their latest album, which unfortunately the CD hasn't arrived in the post yet. Fucking why? I need it. I need it in my veins right now.
Just me from the future interjecting right now, just to reassure you, the CD of the new album arrived today as of editing this video, funnily enough, so rest assured I did receive it, and unbeknownst to me when pre-ordering it, I also received a signed postcard from the band that came with the CD of The Last Will and Testament, which is a fun little note that I thought I would insert here as I'm discussing this album in the video itself. So let's get back to talking about Last Will and Testament.
So The Last Will and Testament, it's probably recency biased, why it's been pushed above Watershed, but for me, this is everything I wanted from Opeth. When S1, the radio single, came out, my jaw was on the floor when Michael growled. The song was already great without the growls included. It had all of the gloomy gothic atmosphere that I loved on Watershed and Reveries. But the death growls coming back for this album on that first single that dropped was just the icing on the cake. Michael's growls sound a bit more exaggerated and cartoony than before, which works for me, honestly. It sounded a bit more stripped back and subtle and reserved with Watershed, Reveries. But on Last Will and Testament, it feels like hammed up and exaggerated, which I enjoyed personally. I think it adds to the dramatic flair that this album has overall. It complements it, in my opinion. S2 has such a creepy, dense atmosphere, and the odd time signatures are so fun, but also make the song sound off-kilter. S3 being the second single, such a great atmosphere to it. I love the doom-laden melodies in the third track as well. The tension-filled moments are so great, but so earwormy at the same time. The melodies in paragraph 4 though, they sound so quirky and creative. I love that the prog rock era style of the band hasn't gone away and they're still willing to use it in their skill set for this album. I also love that S4 just gets to the 3-minute mark and then just decides to become a spy movie soundtrack. Like, what the hell? S5 also I noticed had Eastern rock elements in there that I really enjoyed. This song is so creative. It goes from spooky to adventurous and quirky. The melodies in S6 sound more upbeat and empowered to contrast the unsettled melodies that we've had so far on the album. Meanwhile, S7 sneaks back into an eerie, haunting tone, and the key work on that song complement it perfectly. The spoken word on that track also doesn't sound overbearing for me either. I think it perfectly complements the musicality that that song has. And then as for the closing track, which is the only one that isn't a paragraph number, Story Never Told is such a beautiful closing note and such a gentle, serene moment for the album. The guitars just croon, and the fucking riffage in this power ballad, if you will, is so fucking beautiful. This album has the cinematic quality that I enjoyed so much on Cauda Veninum. I like that it's experimenting with all sorts of musical ideas, both ideas that the band has tried before, like death metal, prog rock, but also sprinkling in some new ideas in there as well. I just enjoy the variety on it. There you go, that was my take on their newest album, Last Will and Testament. I think it's fucking amazing, and I can't lie, it was an absolute treat to have Michael Ackerfeldt's growl vocals back on here, and it's nice that they actually fit with the album's concept rather than it just being, imagine the growls being shoehorned into an album like Sorceress. It just wouldn't have worked in my opinion. And I like that it's not an album we've heard before. They're trying new things on there. It's not just a Watershed Part 2. It feels new. But anyway, now we do move into my top 3, which I'm going to get a bit of sauce for putting this album at third and not at first, but fuck you, this is my list. Blackwater Park. It is a staple progressive death album for a damn reason. There isn't really a skippable track on here. Its influence, its staying power is undeniable. But let's just get into it. Leper Affinity has a really cool stomping gallop. The riffs throughout are gorgeous. This song creates a strong feeling of hopelessness and bleakness. But speaking of, bleak brings such a palpable dissonance to it. Harvest is so fucking beautiful and serene. It's just so soothing and mellow. I fucking love Harvest, one of my favourites on this album. Drapery Falls is unnerving in tone. The music feels unsettling whilst also being engaging and entertaining. Dirge of November starts off sweet and calming and mellow, but quickly erupts into a track that brings the feeling of impending doom. Funeral Portrait has some heavy chug. Patterns in the Ivy is a nice lull in the record as well. It stops for a more mournful, melancholy moment. Then that song does perfectly build into the title track of the album. Speaking of the title track, it has a gargantuan sound. The lead riffs bulldoze through the song, but are appropriately broken up by mellow moments to build mood. It's a very strong Opus track. This album has a more crisp and polished production. The guitars sound a bit better, but I miss the eerie echo-ness that the guitars had on their earlier albums before Blackwater Park. It added extra oomph of atmosphere, for me at least. But all the same, its influence is still felt in prog metal to this day. Enough said. Everyone knows how good Blackwater Park is. Now we're moving on to my two favourite Opeth albums. But my second favourite Opeth album is Still Life. I said it when I was talking about Blackwater Park. There's a certain element to the production on these earlier albums that really made this one stand out with its atmosphere. Like the guitars and growls echo in a way that they don't after this album, which makes the more stripped back, more lo-fi production of these earlier prog death metal albums work for me. There was a perfect marriage of songwriting finesse and early production of Opeth that made this album perfect. The More has a cool, unsettling tone to it. It opens with such lush acoustic strings that just set the mood for a harrowing vibe before it springs into action with a catchy galloping melody. Godhead's Lament have a thrashier energy to it than anything I've heard before on Opeth's career. The mixture of Mike's cleans and the acoustic strings in Benighted are so lush and calming. Moonlapse Vertigo starts with an infectious lead melody which I hummed for weeks after listening to this. Face of Melina is my favourite on here personally, or Melinda I should say. Goes from eerie, mellow and sombre, and then halfway through it just swells up into being heavy, epic and dark. Serenity Painted Death kicks off with a swinging melody full of dark tones and menacing growls. And then White Cluster's lead hook is so massive and daunting, and it was a more than suitable closing track for this album. It's a tight 7-track record, all of which perfectly written without any wasted space in there. Yet most of the songs sit nearly at 10 minutes in length, which should show that by this album, their 4th studio release, that the band has already perfected the art of song progression and how to take the listener through a musical journey without wasting their time. Every track feels like it belongs on this album, but they all have their own unique identity and sonic theme to them. So there you go, that was Still Life, my second favourite Opeth album, and it could have very easily landed in at my number one if it wasn't for Ghost Reveries, which I also don't have a physical copy for because it lives rent-free in the glove box of my car because I listen to it so fucking much. Everything I've praised in all of the other Opeth albums I've talked about today are all at play in Reveries. The proggy style, the lush haunting riffs, the mix of cleans and growl vocals, and the deep and palpable emotion from song to song, varying from sorrow, anguish, hope, rage, etc. So Ghost of Perdition. How about that song, huh? It's a perfect opening track. Hooks you instantly, heavy downtrodden riffs. The grooves and haunting moods sets a standard for the rest of the album. Baying of the Hounds got a great momentum, going perfectly with a catchy bouncy rhythm and some more subtle eerie moments as well. Beneath the Mire dips in and out of intensity but also more mellow moments. It's a great dichotomy, that song. Speaking of, Atonement is such a beautiful, soothing track that drifts between being unnerving and ethereal. As for Harlequin Forest or Reverie, it's a near 12-minute epic that justifies its length in droves. It starts off empowering and hopeful, and then by the end it's turned much more creepy in tone. Hours of Wealth is a beautifully mournful ballad to act as a calm before the storm, and the storm obviously being the next track, The Grand Conjuration. The Grand Conjuration, speaking of, being the penultimate song, is a perfect choice for this album in building up the evil, haunting vibes that has been built up to this point. And this track, this epic, is just a big release of all of those tension-filled moments. It's so sinister and yet epic. I love Grand Conjuration so much. And then Isolation Years. What can I say about that song? It's one of my favourite songs of all time. It's bittersweet, This song holds my favourite use of Mike's clean vocals. When the music swells in the chorus with Mike's sorrowful, soft tone, it still gets me to this day. It gives me full body chills. And it's not just my favourite Opeth album. Top 5 albums of all time for me. Ghost Reveries is seriously an album that I have never got bored of since I discovered it. It is amazing in every sense of the word. I have no words for how much love I have for this album. The album is overflowing with atmosphere. Its themes of gothic and horror are just brilliant, and each of the songs fit that style, but they all each stand on their own with their own identity. It's perfect from a song-to-song standpoint as well as a full album experience, just like Still Life. This album also has my favourite production of any Opeth album. In my eyes, Michael's best vocal work, both with his clean singing and his growls. And also, this album holds most of my favourite Opeth songs, period. And that's why Ghost Reverie sits at the top of the mountain, because not much stands up to it for me. In general, there aren't many other albums that exist that I would sooner listen to again than Ghost Reveries. I just really love that album. But there you go. That has been me ranking all of Opeth's discography. A great honour to finally talk about this band at length with what songs and albums I love so much. And the fact that they've released another absolute banger this year with Last Will and Testament just shows me that this band is still capable of creating some of the very best music that metal can offer, in my opinion. And I'm just so grateful that a band like Opeth exists. They're that good to me. We'll see whether Last Will and Testament ages like fine wine in years to come. I'm sure it will. But yeah, that will about do it. Thank you very much for watching me gushing and nerding out about one of my favourite bands. Let me know how you rank the Opeth discography, and yeah, I guess I'll see you guys in the next one.